Sometimes the heart wants what it shouldn't, and sometimes that wanting can destroy everything you hold dear. In a world where family was all you had, Sarah McKenna was about to discover that love doesn't always follow the rules we're taught. She had grown up watching Samuel, her older brother, become the kind of man legends were made of, a mountain man feared and respected across the frontier. But admiration had turned into something far more dangerous. When she confessed her feelings beneath a golden sunset, his response cut through her like winter wind. "Nobody can know about this." "Sarah, nobody. What happens when the person you love most is the one person you can never have?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The McKenna homestead sat like a weathered sentinel against the backdrop of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, its log walls darkened by decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. Samuel had built most of it himself after their parents died, expanding the original cabin room by room as necessity demanded. The structure bore the marks of a man who understood that in this unforgiving wilderness, shelter meant survival, and survival meant everything. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching her brother emerge from the morning mist like some ancient spirit of the mountains themselves. At 28, Samuel McKenna commanded respect from every trapper, trader, and drifter who crossed their path. His reputation stretched from the Canadian border to the mining camps of Colorado. A man who could track a wounded grizzly through a blizzard, who'd once walked out of Blackfeet territory with 3 arrow wounds and a scalp bounty on his head. The Winchester rifle in his calloused hands had never failed him, just as his word had never been broken. But Sarah saw something others missed in those steel-grey eyes. She saw the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders when he was barely 19, the day they buried their parents beneath the old oak that still stood sentinel over the family plot. She saw the tenderness he tried to hide when he thought no one was watching, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, the careful distance he maintained, as if proximity itself might somehow taint her. "Coffee's ready," she called through the open door, her voice carrying across the yard where Samuel was examining tracks near the corral. He looked up, and for just a moment, before he remembered himself, his face brightened with something warmer than brotherly affection. The transformation in Sarah over the past year hadn't gone unnoticed by the scattered families who made up their corner of civilization. At 18, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men forget their manners, and wives clutch their husbands' arms a little tighter. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like spun copper, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence and determination, uncommon in frontier women. More troubling to the local matrons was her refusal to behave as a proper unmarried woman should. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, their nearest neighbor some 5 miles east, had made her disapproval known on more than one occasion. "It ain't natural," she'd confided to her husband during their last visit, her pinched face twisted with righteous concern. A girl that age living alone with a man, even if he is her brother. She needs a husband's guidance, proper Christian instruction. The way she looks at Samuel sometimes. Her voice had trailed off, heavy with implication. The Patterson homestead represented everything Samuel despised about creeping civilization. Harold Patterson had arrived 2 years prior with grand plans to establish a proper Christian community in the valley, complete with regular church services and strict moral oversight. He viewed Samuel's independence and Sarah's unconventional upbringing as threats to the godly order he sought to impose. She should be married by now. Eleanor had declared during her campaign to find Sarah a suitable husband. Young Jake Morrison would make her a fine match. Good family, God-fearing, and he's got his eye on that fertile bottomland near the creek. Jake Morrison. Sarah's jaw tightened at the thought of the 22-year-old son of the Morrison clan, recent arrivals from Kansas with more ambition than sense. Jake possessed the kind of bland handsomeness that mothers found reassuring and daughters found tedious. He'd made his interest in Sarah abundantly clear during the monthly gathering at the Patterson place, where the scattered families came together for what Eleanor generously called worship and fellowship. Samuel entered the cabin, his boots heavy on the wooden floor he'd laid with his own hands. Every board, every nail, every carefully chinked gap between logs bore the mark of his craftsmanship. This place was his creation, his sanctuary, his fortress against a world that demanded conformity he was unwilling to give. "Patterson's boy was by yesterday while you were checking the traps," Sarah said, pouring coffee into the tin cup Samuel favored. Steam rose between them like incense. "Brought another invitation to Sunday dinner." Samuel's expression darkened. He'd made his feelings about Jake Morrison clear, though perhaps not for the reasons Sarah hoped. "What did you tell him?" "Same thing I always tell him." She handed him the cup, their fingers brushing in a contact that lasted a heartbeat longer than propriety suggested. "That I'm quite capable of managing my own social calendar." "Sarah." Samuel's voice carried a warning she'd grown to recognize. It was the tone he used when she ventured too close to subjects they both knew were dangerous. "The boy means well. His family's got good land, steady income from their wheat crop. A woman needs security." The words stung because they came from him, because they suggested a future where she belonged to someone else, where the easy intimacy they shared would be replaced by the polite distance appropriate between a married woman and her brother-in-law. Sarah had watched it happen to other women, seen the light dim in their eyes as they traded dreams for duty, passion for respectability. "Is that what you want for me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Security?" Samuel set down his cup without drinking, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. "I want what's best for you, what's proper." "And who decides what's proper, Samuel? Mrs. Patterson, the preacher who visits twice a year, or the God who made us both as we are?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Samuel had raised her to think for herself, to question authority, to trust her own judgment above the opinions of others. Now those very lessons were turning against the conventional wisdom he seemed determined to embrace. Their father, God rest his soul, had been a different sort of man. Thomas McKenna had come west with a wife who shared his hunger for freedom, his distrust of society's arbitrary rules. He'd taught both his children to read, not just scripture, but philosophy, poetry, the kinds of books that made other frontier families suspicious. "The mind is God's greatest gift," he'd often said. "Don't let small people convince you to think small thoughts." Sarah remembered the night before their parents' death, how her mother had pulled her aside with urgent whispers. "Promise me you'll take care of each other," she'd said, her eyes bright with fever. "Promise me you'll never let anyone tell you who you're supposed to be." At the time, Sarah had thought she was speaking of the ordinary challenges that faced orphaned children. Only later did she begin to suspect there had been deeper currents in her mother's words, secrets that died with her before they could be fully revealed. Samuel finished his coffee and reached for the Winchester, checking the action with the unconscious efficiency of long practice. "I'll be gone most of the day. There's something prowling around the upper meadow. Took down one of Henderson's calves last week. Tracks suggest it might be that old boar bear that's been giving everyone trouble." Sarah felt the familiar twist of anxiety that accompanied his hunting trips. Samuel was skilled beyond question, but the mountains were full of dangers that could claim even the most experienced woodsman. Weather could turn deadly without warning, rock slides could block familiar paths, and injured animals fought with the desperate fury of creatures with nothing left to lose. "Take the dogs," she said, though she knew he'd already planned to. Rex and Scout were as much a part of his hunting kit as the rifle and his skinning knife. "I'll be back before dark." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Sarah, about what we discussed, about Jake Morrison." "I know." She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "You want me to give him a chance?" "I want you to have a future." After he left, Sarah stood in the empty cabin, feeling the weight of solitude like a physical thing. The silence seemed to echo with possibilities, words that might be spoken, boundaries that might be crossed, truths that might be acknowledged if only they had the courage. She picked up her mother's locket from the kitchen table, the silver warm from the morning sun. Inside was a pressed wildflower, its delicate petals still holding traces of color after all these years. Her mother had worn this locket every day, and Sarah had inherited it along with so many other mysteries about the woman who'd given her life. The afternoon stretched ahead, with its familiar rhythms of cooking, cleaning, tending the garden that provided much of their sustenance. But today, domestic tasks felt like elaborate forms of waiting, ways to fill the hours until Samuel returned and the delicate tension between them could resume its dangerous dance. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, keeping their secrets as they had for millennia before the first white settlers arrived, and as they would long after the last cabin crumbled into dust. But within their shadow, in a hand-built home that smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, a young woman struggled with the terrible, wonderful knowledge that her heart had chosen, a path from which there could be no return. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth that had been growing like wildfire in her chest. She was in love with Samuel McKenna, had been for longer than she cared to admit. And every day that passed without speaking, that truth felt like a small death. The storm arrived without warning, as they often did in the high country. Sarah had been hanging laundry when the first rumble of thunder echoed off the mountain walls, and by the time she'd gathered the clothes and rushed inside, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. Lightning split the darkness in jagged lines, illuminating the cabin in stark, theatrical bursts. Samuel hadn't returned from his hunt. She tried to tell herself it was nothing unusual. He'd weathered countless storms in the wilderness, knew every cave and overhang that could provide shelter. But as the wind howled through the gaps in the log walls and rain hammered against the windows like thrown gravel, her anxiety grew into something approaching panic. By the time full darkness fell, she'd worn a path between the kitchen window and the front door, straining to catch any glimpse of his familiar silhouette through the sheets of rain. The dogs would have warned her if he were approaching, but Rex and Scout lay by the fire, occasionally lifting their heads at particularly violent thunder crashes before settling back into patient waiting. It was past midnight when she finally heard the sound of boots on the porch. The door burst open, admitting Samuel along with a gust of wind that sent papers flying across the room. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered against his skull, his clothes clinging to his powerful frame in ways that made Sarah's breath catch. "I was worried sick," she said, rushing to help him with his rifle and pack. "When the storm hit, found shelter in Miller's Canyon," he said, but his voice was strained. In the firelight she could see something was wrong, a tightness around his eyes, a careful way he moved that suggested injury. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that Samuel tried to hide, the way he protected himself even from her. "It's nothing, just a scrape." But when he shrugged out of his buckskin jacket, the white shirt beneath showed a spreading stain of red along his left shoulder. The sight of his blood made something fierce and protective rise in Sarah's chest, an emotion too powerful for sisterly concern. "Sit down," she commanded, already moving toward the basin where she kept clean cloths and her mother's medical supplies. "Let me see, Sarah, it's just sit down." The authority in her voice surprised them both. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then slowly lowered himself into the wooden chair beside the fire. With careful fingers, she helped him remove the torn shirt, trying not to notice the play of muscle beneath his skin, the scars that mapped a lifetime of dangerous encounters. The wound was a deep gash along his shoulder blade, probably from a sharp branch or rock during his hasty search for shelter. "This needs stitching," she murmured, fetching needle and thread from her sewing basket. She'd done this before. Frontier life demanded such skills, but never had the task felt so intimate, so charged with unspoken meaning. As she worked, Samuel sat statue still, his breathing controlled despite what must have been considerable pain. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every detail, the warmth radiating from his skin, the subtle scent of pine and leather that always clung to him. The way his powerful hands gripped the chair arms with white-knuckled restraint. "There," she said softly, tying off the final stitch. But instead of stepping away, she found herself lingering, her palm flat against his unmarked skin. "Samuel." He turned then, and she found herself looking into his eyes from mere inches away. In the dancing firelight, his face seemed younger somehow, more vulnerable. The careful mask he wore in daylight had slipped, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. Sarah. Her name was barely a whisper on his lips. The storm raged outside, but within the circle of firelight, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Sarah felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next words she spoke would determine whether she stepped back to safety or leaped into the unknown. "I can't pretend anymore," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I can't pretend that what I feel for you is what a sister should feel." Samuel's entire body went rigid. "Don't. I love you," she continued, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Not as a brother, not as a guardian, but as a woman loves a man. I've tried to fight it, tried to convince myself it was wrong, but I can't anymore. I won't stop." Samuel started to rise, but her hand on his chest held him in place. "Look at me, and tell me you don't feel it too," she challenged. "Tell me that when our hands touch, you don't feel the same fire I do. Tell me that when you watch me with Jake Morrison, it doesn't tear something inside you for a moment." She saw the truth naked in his eyes, desire, longing, and a love that matched her own in its desperate intensity. Then the shutters came down, and Samuel gently but firmly moved her hand away. "What you think you feel, it's not real. You're young, isolated. You don't understand the difference between gratitude and don't you dare." Sarah's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Don't you dare tell me what I feel. Don't treat me like a child who doesn't know her own heart." Samuel stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "You are a child. You're my responsibility, I'm a woman." She rose as well, following him across the small room. "I'm 18 years old, Samuel. Old enough to know my own mind, old enough to choose my own path. And I choose you." The journal page that changed everything was tucked beneath her pillow, words she'd written weeks ago in a moment of desperate honesty, trying to make sense of the confusion in her heart. She'd never intended for anyone to see it, but now it seemed like cowardice not to share the truth she'd committed to paper. "I wrote something," she said, moving to retrieve the torn page. "Words I was afraid to say aloud." Samuel watched as she unfolded the paper, her hands trembling slightly. In the firelight, her careful script seemed to burn with its own inner fire. "I dream of his hands, not as a brother's, but as a lover's. I wake with his name on my lips and guilt in my heart. How can something that feels so right be so wrong?" "Sarah, no." But his voice lacked conviction now. She stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse beating rapidly at the base of his throat. "Kiss me," she whispered. "Just once. And if you can honestly tell me afterward that you feel nothing, I'll never speak of this again. I'll marry Jake Morrison or whoever you choose, and I'll be the dutiful sister you want me to be." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's fury and the crackling of the fire. Sarah could see the war being fought in Samuel's eyes, duty against desire, protection against love. The teachings of society against the demands of the heart. "Please," she breathed, and the word seemed to break something inside him. His kiss was everything she'd dreamed, and nothing she could have prepared for. Gentle at first, almost tentative, then deeper as she responded with a passion that matched his own. Her arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, and for a moment the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Samuel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if in pain. "God help us both," he whispered. Then, as if suddenly remembering where they were and what they'd done, he stepped back, his face a mask of horror and self-loathing. "This can't happen," he said, already moving toward his coat. "Nobody can know about this, Sarah, nobody. Where are you going?" "Away. I need to think, He couldn't finish the sentence. "Samuel, please!" But he was already at the door, pausing only to look back at her one last time. In that look, Sarah saw love and longing warring with fear and guilt, a combination that told her their lives had just changed irrevocably. "Stay inside," he said. "Don't follow me." Then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with the storm and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that Samuel McKenna loved her as desperately as she loved him. 3 days passed before Samuel returned, and they were the longest 3 days of Sarah's life. She maintained the routines of daily existence, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, preparing meals that grew cold waiting for him, but every task felt hollow, performed by someone who was merely going through the motions of living. When she finally heard his boots on the porch, her heart leaped and sank simultaneously. Through the window, she could see him standing at the door, as if gathering courage to enter his own home. The Samuel who finally walked inside was a changed man, guarded, formal, treating her with the careful politeness of a stranger. "Morning," he said, hanging his hat on its familiar peg. "Morning." She kept her voice steady, though inside she felt as fragile as winter ice. "There's coffee." He accepted the cup without their fingers touching, a deliberate avoidance that spoke volumes. The easy intimacy they'd shared for years had been replaced by an artificial distance that felt worse than any argument. "I've been thinking," Samuel said, settling into his chair but keeping his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. "About what happened, about what you said." Sarah's pulse quickened, hope and fear warring in her chest. "And it can't happen again." The words came out flat, practiced, as if he'd rehearsed them during his 3-day absence. "What we both felt, it's natural enough, I suppose. We've been isolated, spent too much time in each other's company, without proper guidance. But that doesn't make it right." "Samuel, I failed you." He looked up then, and she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. "I was supposed to protect you, guide you, and instead I let things get confused between us. That's on me, not you." The careful way he spoke, as if the wrong word might shatter them both, made Sarah want to scream. This polite stranger wasn't the man who'd kissed her with desperate hunger 3 nights ago. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we act like the adults we're supposed to be." Samuel rose, moving to the cabinet where he kept his trapping maps. "I've marked some new territory up north. Good beaver sign, fresh elk tracks. I'll be spending more time up there." He spread one of his hand-drawn maps across the table, the careful lines and notations representing countless hours of exploration and observation. Sarah recognized it as more than just a guide to animal trails. It was his escape route, his way of putting physical distance between them when emotional distance proved insufficient. "Running away won't change anything," she said quietly. "I'm not running. I'm doing what's necessary to keep us both safe." His finger traced a path along the map that led deep into the wilderness. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by yesterday while I was gone. Asked a lot of questions about you, about why you weren't at the last community gathering." The mention of their busybody neighbor sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Eleanor Patterson had appointed herself the moral guardian of their scattered community, and her suspicions could prove dangerous. "What did you tell her?" "That you'd been feeling poorly." "But Sarah," Samuel's voice carried a warning, "people are starting to talk. About you rejecting Jake Morrison, about the way you've been keeping to yourself. In a place like this, that kind of talk can spread like wildfire." Sarah knew he was right. The frontier's isolation bred gossip like standing water-bred mosquitoes, and a young unmarried woman, living alone with her brother, even her brother, was naturally suspect. The kiss they'd shared, innocent as it might seem in the larger scheme of things, would be seen as an unforgivable transgression by people like the Pattersons. "Maybe I should reconsider Jake's offer," she said. Testing Samuel's reaction, something flickered in his eyes. Pain, jealousy, loss, before the careful mask slipped back into place. "That might be for the best." The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Sarah felt something inside her rebel against the very idea of sacrificing her truth for other people's comfort. "Is that really what you want?" she pressed. To watch me marry a man I don't love, bear his children, pretend to be happy while dying a little more each day. I want you to have a normal life, a respectable life, whose definition of normal, whose idea of respectable. Sarah moved closer to the table, her hands flat on the rough wood. When did you start caring more about what other people think than about what's true? Samuel's jaw tightened. When I realized that the truth, as you call it, could destroy us both. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, she could see Jake Morrison riding up with his younger brother Tom in tow. Both young men wore their Sunday best, despite the weekday, and Jake carried a bouquet of wildflowers that already looked wilted in the morning heat. "Looks like opportunity's knocking," Samuel said. But there was no warmth in his voice. Sarah felt trapped between the advancing threat of unwanted courtship and Samuel's stubborn insistence on propriety. But as she watched Jake dismount and smooth his hair with nervous hands, an idea began to form, dangerous and desperate, but perhaps their only chance. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll be polite to Jake. I'll listen to what he has to say." Samuel nodded, approval and agony warring in his expression. That's good. He's a decent man, Sarah. He'd treat you well." But as Jake's boots sounded on the porch steps, Sarah caught Samuel's eye and held it. In that look, she tried to communicate everything she couldn't say aloud. That politeness didn't mean acceptance, that listening didn't mean agreeing, and that no matter what performance she gave for the sake of appearances, her heart remained stubbornly, desperately his. Jake's knock came firm and confident, the knock of a man who believed his suit would be welcomed. Samuel moved to answer it, transforming himself into the role of protective older brother with an ease that might have fooled anyone who hadn't seen the raw truth in his eyes moments before. "Jake." "Tom." Samuel's greeting was cordial but cautious. "What brings you boys out this way?" "Afternoon, Samuel." Jake stepped inside, hat in hand, Tom hovering awkwardly behind him. "I was hoping to speak with Miss Sarah, if she's receiving visitors." The formal language sat strangely on the young farmer's tongue, as if he'd been coached by his mother on proper courting etiquette. Sarah rose from her chair, smoothing her dress and summoning a smile that felt like a mask settling over her true face. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Would you care for some coffee?" As she busied herself with cups and the coffee pot, Sarah was acutely aware of Samuel's presence behind her, the way he watched every interaction with the intensity of a guard dog. She could feel the weight of his gaze, could sense the internal struggle between his protective instincts and his desire to see her settled with an appropriate husband. But she could also feel something else, radiating from him, a possessiveness that had nothing to do with brotherly concern and everything to do with the kiss they'd shared 3 nights ago. Jake. Morrison's courtship attempt was as clumsy as Sarah had expected. He perched on the edge of his chair like a bird ready to take flight, occasionally glancing at his brother Tom for moral support that wasn't forthcoming. The wilted wildflowers sat on the table between them like an accusation of good intentions gone wrong. "These are lovely," Sarah said, touching the drooping petals of a mountain laurel. Despite her inner turmoil, she felt genuinely sorry for the young man who was trying so hard to win something he could never have. "I picked them myself this morning," Jake said, his chest puffing slightly with pride. "Thought you might like to press them the way ladies do." Sarah nodded politely, though the irony wasn't lost on her. Pressed flowers were meant to preserve beauty that would otherwise fade, much like the pressed mountain laurel she'd hidden between the pages of her mother's Bible, a secret memento of an afternoon when Samuel had taught her to identify edible plants. She'd saved it not for its botanical significance, but because his hands had brushed hers when he'd shown her how to examine the delicate petals. "That's very thoughtful," she managed. Samuel stood by the window with his arms crossed, his posture suggesting casual observation, while his eyes remained alert to every nuance of the interaction. Tom Morrison fidgeted in the corner, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Miss Sarah," Jake began, then cleared his throat and started again. "Sarah, if I may be so bold, I've been thinking about you a considerable amount lately." Oh. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Samuel's shoulders tense. What I mean to say is, Jake's face had gone bright red. I've spoken with your brother about the possibility of, that is, about whether you might consider what Jake's trying to say, Tom interrupted with obvious exasperation, is that he wants to court you properly, with an eye toward marriage. The word marriage hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah felt the walls of the cabin pressing in around her, the weight of expectation and social convention threatening to crush the fragile hope she'd been nurturing since Samuel's return. That's very flattering, she said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready for such a serious commitment. Jake leaned forward eagerly. Oh, I don't mean right away. I know these things take time. But I've got good land, Sarah, 60 acres of prime bottomland that'll support a fine homestead. My pa's willing to help with the house building, and my ma's already started on a wedding quilt just in case. He stopped abruptly. Realizing he'd revealed too much of his family's presumption, Sarah felt a flash of anger at the casual way her future was being planned without her consent. Your mother has started a wedding quilt, before I've even agreed to courtship? Well, she just thought, that is, we all hoped. Jake's confidence began to crumble under Sarah's steady gaze. What my family hopes, Tom said, shooting his brother a warning look, is that Miss Sarah will give Jake the chance to prove himself worthy of her consideration. Nothing's been assumed, but something had been assumed, Sarah realized. Jake's entire demeanor suggested a man who believed his suit was merely a formality, that any reasonable woman would jump at the chance to marry into the Morrison family. The presumption stung, but more than that, it illuminated the trap that was slowly closing around her. I appreciate your interest, Jake, she said, rising to signal the end of the visit. But I need time to consider such an important decision. Jake stood as well, hope shining in his plain features. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm a patient man, Sarah. I'm willing to wait. After the Morrison brothers left, the cabin felt both larger and smaller. Larger because of the silence that filled it. Smaller because of the weight of unspoken words between Sarah and Samuel. You handled that well, Samuel said finally. Diplomatically, did I? Sarah moved to clear the coffee cups, needing something to do with her hands, because it felt like lying. Sometimes kindness requires a certain amount of diplomacy. Sarah set the cups down harder than necessary. Is that what we're calling it? Kindness? Because from where I stand, it looks more like cowardice. Samuel's face darkened. Careful, Sarah. Why? Are you afraid I might say something true? She turned to face him, her composure finally cracking. Jake Morrison assumes I'll marry him because what other choice does a woman have out here? His mother's already started my wedding quilt, Samuel. They're planning my life like I'm a piece of property to be transferred from one man to another. That's not... It's exactly what it is. Sarah's voice rose. And the worst part is, you're helping them do it. You're so desperate to get rid of me that you'll hand me over to the first man who asks. I'm not trying to get rid of you. Samuel's voice was quiet but intense. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From happiness? From love? From me? The words came out like a confession torn from his throat. From what I want to do to you, what I dream about doing to you. From the fact that every time I look at you, I forget that I'm supposed to be your guardian, and remember only that I'm a man. The raw honesty in his voice stopped Sarah cold. Here, finally, was the truth she'd been waiting to hear, not the careful distance he'd been maintaining, but the real struggle that was tearing him apart. Then stop fighting it, she whispered. I can't. Samuel ran his hands through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration she'd seen countless times before. Don't you understand? If anyone suspected what I feel for you, what happened between us the other night, it wouldn't just destroy my reputation. It would destroy you. Out here, scandal clings to a woman like soot. You'd never be able to escape it. Sarah moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. And if I marry Jake, what happens to me then? Do I just spend the rest of my life pretending to be happy while my heart breaks a little more each day? Hearts mend, Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. do they? Did yours, after Mary Elizabeth? The mention of Samuel's lost love, a girl who died of fever 3 years ago, made him flinch. Mary Elizabeth had been everything a frontier woman was supposed to be: demure, obedient, content to follow rather than lead. Her death had left Samuel withdrawn and bitter, though he'd never spoken of it directly. That was different, was it? Or are you just afraid that what you feel for me is stronger than what you felt for her? Samuel turned away, but not before Sarah saw the truth flash across his face. She pressed her advantage, moving close enough to touch him if she dared. "I won't marry Jake Morrison," she said quietly. "I won't marry anyone unless it's you. If that means I become a spinster, so be it. At least I'll be true to my heart, Sarah, and if people want to talk, let them talk. I'd rather be the subject of gossip than the victim of a loveless marriage." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of her declaration settling between them like a stone thrown into still water. Finally Samuel turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw something that might have been hope. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever known," he said. "I learned from the most stubborn man." Despite everything, Samuel's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. God help us both. The decision to take Sarah deeper into the mountains came 3 weeks later, after Eleanor Patterson made her second pastoral visit in as many days. The woman's sharp eyes had catalogued every detail of the McKenna cabin, from the way Sarah's hair hung loose around her shoulders, to the careful distance Samuel maintained from his sister, a distance that somehow seemed more suspicious than casual. "Intimacy might have. It's not natural for a young woman to isolate herself this way," Eleanor had declared, her thin lips pursed with disapproval. "Brother Henley will be making his rounds next month, and I think it would be beneficial for Sarah to speak with him about her spiritual obligations as an unmarried woman." Brother Henley was the traveling preacher who visited their scattered community twice yearly, dispensing salvation and moral judgment with equal fervor. The thought of Sarah being subjected to his particular brand of Christian counseling made Samuel's blood run cold. "I'll consider your suggestion," he'd replied with forced politeness. But that night he'd made his decision. "We're going to the high cabin," he announced over breakfast, unrolling one of his detailed maps. "There's been talk of wolf sign in the upper valleys. Someone needs to check the traps before winter sets in." Sarah looked up from her eggs, immediately understanding the subtext. The high cabin was Samuel's most remote outpost, a rough shelter tucked into a hidden valley that few people knew existed. It would be at least a week's journey, possibly longer if weather turned against them. "When do we leave?" she asked simply. "Tomorrow at first light. Pack light, just essentials. We'll live off the land mostly." As they prepared for the journey, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The isolation that made the high country dangerous also made it free from the watchful eyes and wagging tongues that had made their lives increasingly difficult. For the first time in weeks, they would be truly alone. No neighbors to judge them, no social conventions to navigate, no pretense to maintain. The wooden cross that hung above their father's chair seemed to watch them as they packed. Thomas McKenna had carved it himself from mountain oak, its simple lines reflecting the straightforward faith of a man who believed in God's presence in the natural world, rather than in the formal strictures of organized religion. Sarah found herself wondering what her father would have thought of their situation. Whether his understanding of love and morality might have been more flexible than Brother Henley's rigid doctrines. They left before dawn, traveling light as Samuel had promised. 2 horses, basic supplies, and weapons enough to handle whatever the wilderness might throw at them. Samuel rode ahead on his bay gelding, following trails that existed more in his memory than on any map, while Sarah followed on her mare, watching the familiar valley fall away behind them. The higher they climbed, the more Samuel seemed to relax. Away from civilization and its demands, he became more like the man Sarah remembered from childhood, confident, at ease in his own skin, untroubled by the opinions of others. She could see the tension leaving his shoulders as they put miles between themselves and the Patterson homestead. "It's beautiful up here," Sarah said as they paused to rest the horses beside a crystalline stream. The mountains rose around them like cathedral walls, their peaks touched with the gold of early autumn. "Peaceful," Samuel agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the scenery. "No one to bother us, no one to judge us for—" He stopped himself, but Sarah heard the unfinished thought. Out here, they could simply be who they were without apology or explanation. The high cabin was even more primitive than Sarah had expected. 4 rough walls, a stone fireplace, and little else. But it was clean and dry, stocked with basic necessities and positioned to command a sweeping view of the valley below. Most importantly, it was theirs alone. "I built this place 5 years ago," Samuel explained as he unsaddled the horses. "Never told anyone about it, not even you. Sometimes a man needs somewhere to go when the world gets too heavy." Sarah could understand the appeal. Standing on the cabin's small porch, she felt as though she'd stepped outside of time itself. The concerns that had weighed so heavily in the valley below, Mrs. Patterson's suspicions, Jake Morrison's expectations, the community's judgment, all seemed distant and unimportant. That first evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of rabbit stew and hardtack, the careful distance Samuel had maintained for weeks began to dissolve. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from the migration patterns of elk to the philosophical questions their father had loved to debate. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they'd lived?" Sarah asked, gazing into the dancing flames. "If Ma and Pa hadn't taken sick?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Every day," he admitted. "Your father was a wise man, Sarah. He might have found a way through this that I can't see. What makes you think there needs to be a way through? Maybe the problem isn't what we feel. Maybe it's what other people expect us to feel." Samuel's hands tightened on his coffee cup. "You can't just ignore society's rules because they're inconvenient, can't you?" "Who made those rules, Samuel?" "Men like Brother Henley, who never had to choose between duty and love. Women like Mrs. Patterson, who married for security rather than passion." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with conviction. "Our parents didn't follow conventional paths. Ma told me once that Grandmother McKenna nearly disowned Pa for marrying beneath his station, but they followed their hearts and they were happy. That was different, was it? Or are you just afraid to believe that happiness might be possible for us too?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'm afraid of a lot of things, Sarah. I'm afraid of ruining your life. I'm afraid of what people would say if they knew the truth. But most of all, I'm afraid that if I let myself love you the way I want to, I won't be able to stop." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This was the closest Samuel had come to a real admission since the night of their kiss. "Then don't stop," she whispered. Samuel looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. In the firelight, with her auburn hair loose around her shoulders and her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames, she looked like something from a dream. "Beautiful and wild and utterly untouchable. You don't know what you're asking," he said. "I know exactly what I'm asking." Sarah rose from her chair and moved toward him, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I'm asking you to stop fighting what we both know is true. I'm asking you to trust that love, real love, is worth whatever price we might have to pay." She knelt beside his chair, her hand covering his on the rough wooden armrest. "I'm asking you to love me, Samuel. Not as a brother, not as a guardian, but as a man loves a woman." Samuel stared down at their joined hands, his breathing shallow and uneven. "Sarah, kiss me again," she said, "like you did that night during the storm. And this time, don't run away." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Samuel wrestled with his conscience. Then slowly, inevitably, his free hand rose to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "God forgive me," he whispered, and lowered his lips to hers. The transformation in their relationship wasn't sudden. It was like watching ice melt in spring, a gradual shift that revealed what had always been beneath the surface. Over the following days at the high cabin, The artificial boundaries Samuel had constructed began to crumble, replaced by something that felt both entirely new and as ancient as the mountains themselves. Sarah woke on their third morning to find Samuel already up, standing on the cabin's porch with his coffee and watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. She joined him in comfortable silence, accepting the cup he offered without their careful choreography of avoided contact. When his arms settled around her shoulders, it felt as natural as breathing. "I used to come up here when the weight of responsibility got too heavy," Samuel said quietly. "After Ma and Pa died, after Mary Elizabeth, whenever I felt like I was drowning in other people's expectations." Sarah leaned into his warmth, marveling at how right it felt to be held by him. "And now I think maybe I was running from the wrong things." His voice carried a wonder she'd never heard before, as if he was discovering truths that had been hidden in plain sight. "Maybe what I thought was duty was really fear, and what I thought was wrong was the only thing that was ever right." Their kiss the night before had been different from the desperate encounter during the thunderstorm. This time there had been no guilt, no immediate flight, only a slow exploration of feelings that had been denied too long. They talked until the fire burned low, sharing memories and dreams with an intimacy that went deeper than physical touch. "Black Wolf is coming," Samuel said suddenly, his attention caught by movement on the distant trail. Sarah followed his gaze and saw the lone rider making his way up the mountain path with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged to the wilderness as completely as the eagles and the pines. Black Wolf was Blackfoot, though he'd long ago made his peace with the white settlers who'd claimed his people's hunting grounds. He traded fairly, spoke English better than many who'd been born to it, and had saved Samuel's life more than once during the early years when pride had made the young mountain man careless. More than that, he possessed a wisdom that seemed to come from the earth itself, an understanding of natural law that transcended the artificial boundaries imposed by civilization. "He has good timing," Sarah murmured, stepping back from Samuel's embrace as the rider approached. She'd met Black Wolf only twice before, but both encounters had left her with the impression of a man who saw more than he revealed. The Blackfoot warrior dismounted with fluid grace, his weathered face creasing into what might have been amusement as he took in the scene before him. He was perhaps 50 years old, his long black hair streaked with silver, his dark eyes holding depths that spoke of both great joy and great sorrow. "Little brother," he said to Samuel in his accented English, using the name he'd given him years ago. "You hide in the high places again." "Not hiding this time," Samuel replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Just thinking." Black Wolf's gaze shifted to Sarah, studying her with the same intensity he might use to read weather patterns in the sky. "And the thinking, it brings you wisdom?" Before Samuel could answer, Black Wolf reached into his pack and withdrew something wrapped in soft doeskin. "I bring you a gift," he said, offering it to Sarah, "from the grandmother who sees all hearts." Sarah unwrapped the package with careful fingers, revealing a beaded medicine pouch of extraordinary beauty. The intricate patterns seemed to tell a story in colors and symbols she couldn't read, but somehow understood on a deeper level. It spoke of protection, of journeys both physical and spiritual, of love that transcended the boundaries others would impose. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But I can't." "You can," Black Wolf said firmly. "The grandmother made it for the woman who would love little brother with a pure heart. She saw you in the smoke and knew." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Black Wolf, we appreciate the gesture, but Sarah and I, we're not." "You are not what the white man's law says you should be," Black Wolf agreed calmly. "But the heart does not read white man's law. The heart reads only truth." He settled cross-legged on the porch with the ease of someone equally comfortable in palaces or wilderness. "Among my people we have seen many kinds of love. Love between man and woman who share blood of the body. This we do not permit, for it makes weak children. But love between those who share only blood of the heart." He shrugged eloquently. "This is different matter." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Black Wolf studied them both with those ancient eyes. Little brother never speaks of his beginning, but old Black Wolf remembers. Remembers when the white trader came to winter camp with white woman and white child who was not born to them, but loved like their own. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Sarah saw him sway slightly, his face going pale beneath his weathered tan. "What are you saying?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "I am saying that sometimes the heart knows truths the mind has forgotten." Black Wolf's voice was gentle, but implacable. "The woman who loved you both, she carried secrets in her heart. Secrets she thought would die with her. But the earth remembers, little brother. And those who listen to Earth's voice, they remember too." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what Black Wolf was suggesting. If what he hinted at was true, if she and Samuel weren't actually— "You're saying Sarah and I aren't really—" Samuel couldn't finish the sentence. "I am saying that the white trader's woman took in more than one child who needed love. I'm saying that some secrets are too heavy for dying woman to carry into the spirit world." Black Wolf reached into his pack again, producing a small object wrapped in cloth. "I am saying that before she crossed over, she asked me to keep this safe until the time came when truth was needed more than comfort." "Catherine!" Sarah whispered. "But our mother's name was Margaret. Margaret was the woman who raised you both," Black Wolf said gently. "But she was not the woman who bore either of you. That woman, Catherine, she died when little brother was very young. The woman you called mother, she took him as her own, just as she later took you when your birth parents died of the fever." Samuel sank onto the porch step as if his legs would no longer support him. The daguerreotype shook in his hands, and Sarah could see tears gathering in his eyes. "We're not—" he began, then stopped. "Brother and sister by love, not by blood," Black Wolf confirmed. "The woman who raised you, she thought this knowledge would burden you both. She thought it better you grow up as true siblings than know you were both orphans," she gathered to her heart. "But love, true love, it cannot be caged by well-meaning lies." Sarah felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted, revealing new landscapes she'd never imagined. Everything, all the guilt, all the shame, all the desperate certainty that their love was forbidden, had been built on a foundation that had just crumbled into dust. "All these years," Samuel whispered. "All this guilt, all this fighting against what I felt was necessary," Black Wolf said firmly. "You needed to know the strength of your love, needed to prove it was real before truth could set you free. The grandmother, she sees the long path, not just the single step." Sarah knelt beside Samuel, her hands covering his as they held the precious photograph. "We're free," she whispered, wonder and relief warring in her voice. "Samuel, we're actually free." When he looked at her, the careful mask he'd worn for so long was completely gone. In its place was raw emotion, love, relief, and something that might have been joy struggling to break through years of self-denial. "I've loved you so long," he said, his voice breaking. "Fought it so hard." "You don't have to fight anymore," Sarah said, and kissed him with all the passion she'd kept locked in her heart. The revelation hung in the mountain air like morning mist, beautiful and transformative and utterly surreal. Sarah stared at the daguerreotype until her eyes burned, tracing every line of the young woman's face. Catherine McKenna, Samuel's birth mother, a stranger who held the key to their freedom. "Tell me everything," Samuel said to Black Wolf, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Tell me what you remember about my real parents." "About Sarah's." Black Wolf settled more comfortably on the porch, his dark eyes distant with memory. "Your father, your blood father, he was Thomas McKenna's younger brother. James McKenna, called Jamie by those who loved him. He came west in 51 with his wife Catherine and baby son. Planned to meet Thomas, start a cattle ranch together in this valley." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Samuel wasn't Thomas McKenna's son, he was his nephew. The implications cascaded through her mind like stones down a mountainside. What happened to them? Samuel asked. "Winter of 52 was hard. Hardest anyone could remember. Jamie and Catherine, they were caught in early blizzard trying to reach Thomas's cabin. Found them both dead, but the baby, you, little brother. You were wrapped so tight in your mother's arms that her body heat kept you warm. until rescue came. Black Wolf paused, his weathered face grave with old sorrow. Thomas and Margaret, they had been trying for child of their own for 3 years. When they found you alive in your dead mother's arms, Margaret said it was sign from Great Spirit. She took you as her own, raised you as true son, and Sarah. Samuel's voice was barely audible. That came later. When you were 6 summers old, the family came through with wagon train. Man named Garrett, wife named Anne, and little girl with hair like sunset. Black Wolf's eyes found Sarah's. Fever took them both within days of reaching the valley. Left only the child. Sarah's breath came in short gasps. Garrett? My real name was Sarah Garrett. Sarah Garrett, who became Sarah McKenna, Black Wolf confirmed. Margaret. She could not bear to see another child orphaned. She and Thomas, they took you in, made you sister to the boy they already loved as son. You were family by choice, by love, but not by blood. The old Blackfoot reached into his pack one final time, producing a small leather pouch. When Margaret grew sick, she called me to her bedside, made me promise to keep these safe until the day came when truth was needed. She feared, he paused, choosing his words carefully. She feared that if you knew you were not blood siblings, you might not grow to love each other as family should. She wanted you to have bond of shared childhood before you knew bond of marriage was possible. Samuel took the pouch with shaking hands, spilling its contents onto his palm. A simple gold ring that must have belonged to Catherine McKenna. A small cross that had been Jamie's and folded tight. A piece of paper that crackled with age. Sarah leaned closer as Samuel unfolded the paper, revealing their adoptive mother's careful handwriting. My beloved Samuel and Sarah, if you are reading this, then the time has come for truth. I've loved you both as if you came from my own body, but I have also seen the way you look at each other as you have grown. What others might call sin, I call the working of providence. You were brought together by tragedy but bound by love, first as siblings of the heart, now perhaps as something more. James and Catherine would have blessed such a union, as would Anne and Robert Garrett. You are not bound by the laws that would keep blood relatives apart. You are free to love as your hearts command. Be happy, my children. Be true to the love that has sustained you both. Your loving mother, Margaret McKenna. The letter fluttered from Samuel's nerveless fingers as the full weight of their liberation settled over them. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of wonder at the intricate way their lives had been woven together. She knew, Sarah whispered. Somehow, she knew this would happen. Mother always was wise about matters of the heart, Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. She must have seen the way I looked at you, even when I was trying so hard to hide it. Black Wolf rose gracefully to his feet. The grandmother's work is finished. The truth has found its way to light, as truth always does. He placed a weathered hand on Samuel's shoulder. You have fought honorable fight against what you thought was wrong. Now you know it was right all along. Do not waste more time in doubt. But what about the community? What will we tell people? Sarah asked, practical concerns beginning to intrude on the euphoria of revelation. Black Wolf's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. You tell them truth, that you discovered you were never blood siblings, that your love is blessed by law of white man and law of Great Spirit both. Those who would judge you, they judged their own small hearts, not yours. Samuel stood slowly, the daguerreotype still clutched in his hand like a talisman. It won't be easy. People have believed one thing about us for so long. Let them talk, Sarah said with sudden fierce determination. Let them whisper and speculate and disapprove. We know the truth now, Samuel. We know we're free to love each other without shame or guilt. That's all that matters. Black Wolf nodded approvingly. The woman speaks wisdom. Love that is true needs no permission from small minds. As the old warrior prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. The grandmother left one more message. She said to tell you that your children, when they come, they will be blessed with the strength that comes from love, freely chosen, rather than duty, blindly followed. The old blood and new blood, mixed in love. This makes strong foundation for future generations. After Black Wolf's departure, Samuel and Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. The relief was almost overwhelming. Years of guilt and self-denial had been swept away in a single afternoon, replaced by the dizzying possibility of a future they'd never dared imagine. "I need to ask you something," Samuel said finally, turning to face her fully. "Now that we know the truth, now that we're free to choose without guilt, what do you want, Sarah?" "Really want?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "I want you. I want to be your wife, bear your children, build a life with you that's based on truth instead of secrets. I want to go back to that valley and face down anyone who tries to tell us our love is wrong." Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that still clung to her lashes. "I want those things too, more than I've ever wanted anything, but I need you to understand, it won't be easy. People like the Pattersons, they'll make our lives difficult. There will be gossip, judgment, probably outright hostility." "Let them try," Sarah said, covering his hands with hers. "We've spent years believing we were living a lie. Now we know we were living the truth all along. That makes us stronger than any gossip, stronger than any judgment they can throw at us." Samuel's kiss was different this time, not stolen or desperate or shadowed by guilt, but open and honest and full of promise. When they broke apart, Sarah saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, complete and utter peace. "When do we go back?" she asked. "Soon," Samuel said. "But not yet. We have time now, Sarah, time to be together without hiding, without fear. Let's take a few days to be happy before we face the world." Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I love you, Samuel McKenna. I've loved you since I was old enough to understand what love meant. And now I get to spend the rest of my life showing you how much I love you too." "Sarah Garrett McKenna," Samuel replied. And the sound of her new name, her true name, was like music in the mountain air. The 3 days that followed Black Wolf's revelation were the happiest of Sarah's life. Freed from the weight of guilt and forbidden desire, she and Samuel discovered each other as lovers, with a tenderness and passion that felt both entirely new and as old as the mountains themselves. They talked for hours about their childhood, re-examining shared memories through the lens of their new understanding. They made love with the desperate joy of prisoners suddenly released from captivity. They planned a future that had seemed impossible just days before. But beneath the euphoria, practical concerns began to surface. They couldn't hide in the high country forever, and when they returned to civilization, they would face challenges that would test their newfound happiness. "We need evidence," Samuel said on their final morning at the cabin, studying the daguerreotype and Margaret's letter by morning light. "These are precious, but they're also fragile. If something happened to them, we'd have no way to prove our story." Sarah understood his concern. The frontier was a place where documentation mattered. Land claims, marriage certificates, bills of sale. Their entire future hung on their ability to prove they weren't blood siblings. And that proof existed in the form of aging photographs and handwritten letters that could be destroyed by fire, water, or simple mishandling. "Is there anywhere else we might find records?" Sarah asked. "Church registers, government documents?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of revelation. "There might be," he said slowly. "Sarah, there's something I never told you about my past. Something I've kept hidden for reasons that seemed important at the time." Sarah felt a flicker of unease. After all the secrets that had shaped their lives, the prospect of another hidden truth was unsettling. What kind of something? Samuel rose and moved to his pack, withdrawing a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unwrapped it, Sarah gasped. It was a star-shaped badge, tarnished with age, but unmistakably official. A United States Marshal's star. "You were a lawman." Sarah stared at the badge in shock. "When? Why didn't you ever—" "For 3 years, before I came back here permanently," Samuel said, his voice heavy with old memories. "Right after Mary Elizabeth died, I couldn't stand staying in one place, couldn't handle the sympathy and the constant reminders of what I'd lost." So I took the marshal's commission and spent 3 years tracking outlaws across the territorial lines. The implications were staggering. Samuel wasn't just a mountain man and tracker, he was a federal officer with authority that extended far beyond their isolated valley. I was good at it, Samuel continued. Too good, maybe. I made enemies, the kind that hold grudges and have long memories. When I finally came home, I decided it was safer for everyone if people thought I was just Thomas McKenna's son. Living quietly in the wilderness, Sarah picked up the star, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. But if you're still a marshal, the commission never expired, Samuel confirmed. Technically, I'm still a federal officer, and federal officers have access to territorial records, military documentation, immigration files, all the paperwork that might corroborate our story. The plan that began to take shape was audacious and risky. They would return to the valley not as fugitives from scandal, but as law enforcement officials conducting an investigation into their own family history. Samuel's authority as a marshal would give them access to records and testimony that might otherwise be denied them. It's dangerous, Samuel warned as they prepared for the journey back. If word gets out that I'm still active as a marshal, some of the men I put in prison might come looking for revenge. And if we're wrong about what we'll find in the territorial records, we're not wrong, Sarah said with quiet certainty. Black Wolf wouldn't have lied to us, and Mother's letter confirms everything he said. The documentation is out there. We just have to find it. The ride back to civilization was both triumphant and tense. They traveled openly now as a couple, no longer hiding their affection or maintaining the careful distance that had once been necessary. But they also traveled with the knowledge that their return would create a firestorm of speculation and judgment. They reached the outskirts of their valley on a golden afternoon, the familiar landmarks both welcoming and ominous. Samuel had pinned the marshal's star inside his jacket, its presence a constant reminder of the authority he carried and the responsibility that came with it. Their first stop was the Patterson homestead, where they found Eleanor in her kitchen, preparing what appeared to be a meal for an army. Through the window, they could see at least a dozen people gathered in the main room, practically the entire adult population of their scattered community. Looks like we're the main topic of conversation, Samuel observed grimly. Good, Sarah replied, with more confidence than she felt. Let them talk. When we're finished, they'll have something real to discuss. Eleanor Patterson's face, when she opened the door, was a study in conflicting emotions, relief at seeing them safe, suspicion about their long absence, and something that might have been triumph at having her worst fears apparently confirmed. Samuel. Sarah! She stepped back to let them enter, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of their appearance. We've been so worried. When you didn't return when expected, we had business to attend to, Samuel said calmly, removing his hat but not his jacket. Family business that required considerable time to resolve. The gathering in the main room fell silent as they entered. Sarah recognized most of the faces, the Morrison family, the Hendersons, the Clarks, and several others. Jake Morrison sat near the window, his face a mask of hurt and confusion. Brother Henley, the traveling preacher, occupied the place of honor near the fireplace, his severe features radiating moral authority. Sister Sarah, Brother Henley rose as they entered, his voice carrying the weight of expected confession and redemption. Brother Samuel, the Lord works in mysterious ways to bring his children home, to face their transgressions. Samuel's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket, where the marshal's star rested against his chest. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Brother Henley. We haven't come to confess anything. We've come to share some remarkable news about our family history. Samuel McKenna. Harold Patterson stepped forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. You've taken advantage of your position as guardian long enough. That young woman has been living in sin under your roof, and the time has come for— Careful, Patterson. Samuel's voice carried a quiet authority that stopped the older man mid-sentence. You're making accusations without evidence, and that's a dangerous habit. Sarah moved to stand beside Samuel, her chin raised defiantly. Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Patterson, all of you. We understand your concerns, but they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding about our relationship. Misunderstanding. Eleanor Patterson's voice rose to a near shriek. Child, we have eyes. We've seen the way you look at each other, the way you've isolated yourselves from decent Christian fellowship. What else are we supposed to think? You're supposed to think that two people who love each other have discovered they're free to express that love honorably, Samuel said. Sarah and I are not blood siblings. We never were. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see shock, disbelief, and calculation warring on various faces around the room. That's impossible, Brother Henley declared. You've both claimed to be children of Thomas and Margaret McKenna. Children raised by Thomas and Margaret McKenna, Samuel corrected. Not born to them. I was their nephew, orphaned in infancy and taken in by my uncle and his wife. Sarah was the daughter of family friends, similarly orphaned and adopted by the same loving couple. Samuel reached into his jacket and withdrew the marshal's star, pinning it to his vest with deliberate ceremony. The effect on the room was electric. Several people gasped. Jake Morrison's face went white. And Harold Patterson actually stepped backward. My name is Samuel McKenna, United States Marshal, Territory of Montana, Samuel said formally. And I have evidence to support everything I've just told you. He produced the daguerreotype and Margaret's letter, passing them around the room with the calm authority of a man accustomed to presenting evidence in court. Sarah watched as faces changed from suspicion to confusion to gradual acceptance. This is quite a story, Brother Henley said after examining the documents. But these could have been fabricated. Could have been, Samuel agreed. Which is why I'll be traveling to the territorial capital next week to access the official records that will corroborate our account. Birth certificates, death records, adoption papers, all the documentation that proves Sarah Garrett and Samuel McKenna are free to marry under both territorial law and God's law. The phrase, free to marry, hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Sarah felt all eyes turn to her, waiting for her response to what amounted to a public proposal. Yes, she said simply, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel McKenna. The explosion of voices that followed, some supportive, some scandalized, all excited, told them that their story would be the talk of the territory within days. But as Samuel took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that was both tender and defiant, Sarah felt only joy. They had the truth on their side now, and that was a power stronger than any gossip, any judgment, any force their enemies could bring to bear against them. The confrontation Sarah had expected came 3 days later, announced by the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin at dawn. Through the window, she could see Harold Patterson leading a group of nearly 20 men, all armed and grim-faced. The sight sent ice through her veins, but Samuel's reaction was immediate and professional. "Stay inside," he ordered, checking his rifle and strapping on his sidearm with the fluid efficiency of a man who'd faced similar situations before. "Whatever happens, don't come out until it's over." The town bell, a large brass bell that Harold Patterson had hauled from Kansas to serve as both a call to worship and a community alarm, rang out across the valley in harsh, insistent peals. Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't just an impromptu gathering of concerned neighbors. This was an organized action, complete with the symbolic authority of community justice. Samuel stepped onto the porch as the riders formed a semicircle around the cabin, their weapons prominently displayed, but not yet directly threatening. Harold Patterson urged his horse forward, his face flushed with the fervor of righteous anger. "Samuel McKenna," Patterson's voice carried across the morning air, "you stand accused before this community of living in sin with a woman under your protection. Despite your claims of new evidence, we find your story unconvincing and your behavior an affront to Christian morality." Sarah pressed herself against the window, her heart hammering as she watched Samuel face down 20 armed men with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to long odds. His martial star caught the morning light, but she could see that several of the men seemed unimpressed by his federal authority. Harold, Samuel said conversationally. "You're making a serious mistake. You're threatening a federal officer in the performance of his duty." "Federal officer?" Jake Morrison pushed his horse forward, his young face twisted with jealousy and wounded pride. "You've been hiding behind that star your whole life, Samuel. But it doesn't change what everyone knows. You've been living in sin with your own sister. Half the territory saw you two at Patterson's place," called out Tom Henderson from the back of the group. "Saw the way she looked at you, the way you protected her. That ain't brotherly love, and we all know it." Samuel's hand moved casually to rest on his pistol grip. "Gentlemen, I'm going to explain this one more time, and I'm going to do it slowly so there's no confusion. Sarah and I are not blood relatives. We were both orphans, taken in by Thomas and Margaret McKenna. We have documentary evidence of this fact, and we have legal authority to investigate and verify that evidence. Documents can be forged." Brother Henley's voice rang out from somewhere in the group. "Testimony can be fabricated, but the eyes don't lie. And we've all seen the unholy desire between you." Sarah felt fury building in her chest. These men, these self-appointed guardians of morality, were determined to destroy their happiness, regardless of evidence or truth. The injustice of it made her hands shake with rage. "The only unholy thing here," Samuel said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that made several horses dance nervously, "is a mob of armed men threatening innocent people based on gossip and superstition." Harold Patterson's face darkened. "Innocent? Boy, I've lived long enough to recognize sin when I see it. And what I see is a man who's taken advantage of his position to corrupt a young woman entrusted to his care." "Then you see poorly," Samuel replied. "What you see is two people who discovered they were free to love each other honorably and who intend to do exactly that." Jake Morrison's control finally snapped. "Honor? You call it honor to steal another man's intended bride? Sarah was supposed to marry me, Samuel. Everyone knew it. Everyone expected it. Everyone except Sarah," Samuel said coldly. "Since when does a woman's consent matter less than community expectations?" The young farmer's face went white with rage. "You turned her against me, filled her head with romantic nonsense when she should have been learning her proper place as a wife and mother." "Her proper place is wherever she chooses it to be," Samuel said. And Sarah felt her heart swell with love and pride. "Not where you or anyone else decides it should be." From inside the cabin, Sarah could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. The men were working themselves into the kind of righteous fury that led to violence, and Samuel, despite his authority and skill, was badly outnumbered. Brother Henley's voice rose above the murmur of angry voices. "The wages of sin is death, Samuel McKenna. If you will not repent and release this woman from your corruption, then perhaps sterner measures are required." The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that these men had not come to listen to evidence or reason. They had come to impose their will through force, and no amount of legal authority or documentary proof was going to deter them. She looked around the cabin desperately, searching for something, anything, that might tip the scales in their favor. Her gaze fell on the small trunk where Samuel kept his most important possessions, and sudden inspiration struck. If these men wanted proof of their innocence, she would give them proof they couldn't ignore or explain away. Against Samuel's explicit instructions, Sarah burst through the cabin door with the small wooden box that had rested undisturbed in their adoptive father's trunk for over a decade. The sudden appearance of a woman in what was clearly becoming a standoff caused several horses to shy and their riders to curse. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on the lead riders. "Stop," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Before you do something you'll regret, there's something else you need to see." "Sarah, get back inside," Samuel said urgently, but she ignored him, moving to stand beside him on the porch with her chin raised defiantly. "Mr. Patterson, Brother Henley, all of you claim you want truth. Then here's truth you can't dispute." She opened the box with careful hands, revealing its precious contents. "This is the marriage certificate of Thomas and Margaret McKenna, their second marriage certificate. The words caused a ripple of confusion through the assembled men. Harold Patterson frowned deeply. Second marriage? What nonsense is this? Sarah unfolded the age document with reverent care. Thomas McKenna was married twice. First to Catherine McKenna in 1851, Samuel's mother, who died in the blizzard. This certificate, dated 1854, records his marriage to Margaret Sullivan, the woman who became my adoptive mother. She held up the document so all could see the official seals and signatures. According to this legal record, Samuel McKenna is the son of Thomas McKenna and Catherine McKenna. I am Sarah Garrett, daughter of Robert and Anne Garrett, adopted by Thomas and Margaret McKenna in 1858. We share no blood relation whatsoever. Brother Henley dismounted and approached the porch, his severe face skeptical. Let me examine that document. Sarah handed over the certificate, watching as the preacher's eyes moved over every line of text, every official stamp. She could see the exact moment when the legal reality of what he was reading began to penetrate his certainty. This appears to be genuine, he admitted reluctantly. But appearances can be deceiving, can they? Samuel's voice cut through the preacher's objections with quiet authority. Brother Henley, you've been questioning God's providence in bringing Sarah and me together. Perhaps instead you should consider that the Almighty has a plan that goes beyond your understanding. Jake Morrison pushed his horse closer, his face desperate. Even if this is true, even if you're not blood siblings, it doesn't change anything. Sarah was meant to be my wife. Everyone knew it. Everyone expected it. Everyone except the person whose opinion matters most, Sarah said firmly. Jake, I'm sorry if I gave you false hope, but I never promised you anything. I never agreed to marriage, never gave you reason to believe I returned your feelings. You didn't have to, Jake shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. Your brother gave his blessing for my courtship. That was as good as a promise in my book. My blessing was conditional on Sarah's consent, Samuel said coldly. Consent she never gave and never will give. Harold Patterson, who had been studying the marriage certificate with growing unease, finally spoke. Even if this document is authentic, and I'm not saying it is, it doesn't excuse the impropriety of your behavior. A man doesn't look at his sister the way you've been looking at Sarah, blood relation or not. You're right, Samuel said, surprising everyone. A brother doesn't look at his sister that way. But a man in love looks at the woman he intends to marry exactly that way. The simple honesty in his voice seemed to deflate some of the righteous anger from the group. Several men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps realizing they were interfering in what was, legally and morally, a private matter between two consenting adults. But Jake Morrison's fury had reached a breaking point. I won't stand for this, he declared, his hand moving toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Sarah, you've been bewitched by this man's lies and manipulation, but I can free you from his influence. The young farmer never completed his threat. Samuel's pistol appeared in his hand with startling speed. The barrel trained steadily on Jake's chest. Son, Samuel said in the calm, professional tone of a lawman who had faced down far more dangerous men than Jake Morrison. You're about to make the last mistake of your very short life. I suggest you reconsider. The metallic sound of weapons being cocked echoed across the clearing as half the men reached for their guns, while the other half seemed suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of their mission. Brother Henley stepped back hastily, the marriage certificate still clutched in his hands. This is madness. Eleanor Patterson's shrill voice cut through the tension as she urged her horse forward. Harold, these people have legal documentation. If they're not blood relatives, then there's no sin in their union, only our mistaken assumptions. Legal documentation that could have been forged, her husband replied. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Sarah saw their moment and seized it. Then let's settle this once and for all, she called out. Samuel has offered to travel to the territorial capital to verify our story through official channels. Instead of threatening us with violence, why don't some of you accompany us? Witness the investigation firsthand. The suggestion caused a ripple of conversation through the group. Sarah could see that several men were beginning to have doubts about their course of action, particularly as Samuel's gun remained rock steady in his hand. "I'll go," Tom Henderson said suddenly. "If there are official records that prove your story, I want to see them with my own eyes." "As will I," Brother Henley added reluctantly, "though I pray we find evidence of truth rather than elaborate deception." Harold Patterson's face was purple with frustrated rage. "This is all smoke and mirrors, legal trickery designed to cover up moral corruption." "Harold!" Eleanor Patterson's voice carried surprising steel. "You've seen the documentation. You've heard their explanation. Unless you have proof of wrongdoing, real proof, not suspicion and gossip, then we should let the territorial authorities settle the matter." Jake Morrison's rifle was halfway out of its scabbard when his older brother Tom grabbed his wrist. "Jake, don't. You draw that weapon and you'll be facing a federal marshal in a gunfight. Is Sarah worth dying over?" "She was supposed to be mine," Jake said, but his voice had lost its earlier fire. "Everyone said she was meant to be mine. People say a lot of things," Sarah said gently. "But the heart chooses its own path, Jake. I never meant to hurt you. But I can't marry someone I don't love just to meet other people's expectations." Samuel's gun never wavered, but his voice carried unexpected compassion. "Jake, you're a good man. You'll find a woman who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. But that woman isn't Sarah, and forcing the issue won't change that." The standoff stretched for long minutes, punctuated only by the nervous shifting of horses and the distant call of mountain birds. Finally, Harold Patterson seemed to deflate, his righteous fury replaced by grudging acceptance. "Fine," he said bitterly. "Go to the territorial capital. Prove your story if you can. But if you're lying, if this is all an elaborate deception, then God help you both, because I won't." As the group began to disperse, Jake Morrison remained behind, his face a mask of hurt and confusion. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if you ever change your mind, if you ever realize you've made a mistake—" "I won't," Sarah said with gentle firmness. "But I hope someday you'll understand that love can't be forced or negotiated or expected. It simply is, or it isn't. Samuel didn't holster his weapon until the last rider disappeared over the ridge. When he finally did, Sarah saw that his hand was shaking slightly. Not from fear, she realized, but from the adrenaline of a confrontation that could have ended in bloodshed. "Well," he said with forced lightness, "that went better than I expected." Sarah laughed, surprising them both with the sound. "Better? Samuel, we were nearly shot by 20 armed men." "Nearly," Samuel agreed, pulling her into his arms. "But we weren't, and now they know the truth, or at least part of it. The rest we can prove in the territorial capital." As Sarah melted into his embrace, she felt the last barriers between them finally crumble. They had faced down community judgment and emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not as siblings bound by duty, but as lovers bound by choice. 6 months later, Sarah McKenna, now Sarah McKenna in truth as well as name, stood in the same kitchen where she had first acknowledged her forbidden love, but everything had changed. The simple gold band on her finger caught the morning light as she prepared coffee for her husband, a word that still sent warmth through her chest every time she thought it. Their wedding had taken place in the territorial capital, witnessed by officials who had thoroughly verified their story through birth records, death certificates, and adoption papers. The documentation had been overwhelming and incontrovertible. Samuel McKenna, son of James and Catherine McKenna, and Sarah Garrett McKenna, daughter of Robert and Ann Garrett, united in marriage with the blessing of both territorial law and divine providence. Brother Henley had performed the ceremony with grudging grace, his earlier suspicions replaced by what might have been approval. "Perhaps," he had said afterward, "the Lord's ways are indeed mysterious, bringing two hearts together through such a circuitous path." The community's acceptance had been slower but genuine. Harold Patterson still maintained a certain stiff formality around them, but even Eleanor had begun to soften. particularly after Sarah had helped deliver the Morrisons' new baby during a difficult birth that had tested all her frontier medical skills. Jake Morrison had taken the news of their marriage hard, but had eventually found solace in the arms of Rebecca Clark, a recent arrival from Ohio who appreciated his steady nature and agricultural ambitions. Their own wedding was planned for the following month, and Sarah had been surprised to receive an invitation. "He's a good man," she had told Samuel when the invitation arrived. "I'm glad he found someone who can love him the way he deserves. Are you sure you want to attend?" Samuel had asked, concerned about potential awkwardness. "I think we should," Sarah had replied. "It will show the community that there are no hard feelings, that we can all move forward." The morning sun, streaming through their kitchen window, carried the promise of spring, and with it the promise of new beginnings. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, where the first McKenna of the next generation was beginning to grow. She hadn't told Samuel yet. The signs were still subtle, known only to her, but she planned to share the news that evening. Their child would be born free of the shadows that had haunted their parents' love, free to grow up in a home where affection was openly expressed and honestly felt. The thought filled Sarah with a joy so pure it almost took her breath away. Samuel emerged from their bedroom, now expanded to accommodate married life, his hair still tousled from sleep. The nightmares that had plagued him during their years of denial had finally stopped, replaced by the peaceful rest of a man at peace with his choices. "Good morning, Mrs. McKenna," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and nuzzling her neck in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Good morning." "Marshal McKenna," she replied, leaning back into his warmth. Samuel had resumed his duties as a federal marshal on a part-time basis, taking assignments that kept him close to home while still serving the cause of frontier justice. "Any word from Black Wolf?" Sarah asked as Samuel accepted his morning coffee. "He stopped by yesterday while you were visiting the Hendersons," Samuel said. "Brought news from the grandmother. She wanted to know when we were planning to give her great-grandchildren to spoil." Sarah hid her smile behind her coffee cup. "And what did you tell him?" "That these things happen in their own time, according to God's plan and nature's schedule." "Very diplomatic," Sarah said, making a mental note to thank the ancient Blackfoot woman who had played such a crucial role in their happiness. The medicine pouch Black Wolf had given her still hung around her neck, its intricate beadwork a daily reminder of the acceptance and blessing they had received from unexpected sources. "I've been thinking," Samuel said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many meals as siblings, where they now shared breakfast as husband and wife, "about expanding the cabin, adding on a proper parlor, maybe another bedroom or two." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Planning for the future, are we?" Samuel's eyes met hers with the warmth that still made her heart skip beats. "Always. I want this place to be worthy of the family we're building." The word family hung in the air between them, rich with possibility and promise. Sarah thought of their adoptive parents, of the love that had transcended blood relations to create bonds stronger than genetics. She thought of the community that had initially opposed them, but had eventually embraced their union. Most of all, she thought of the child growing within her, the living symbol of love that had refused to be denied. "Samuel," she said softly, setting down her coffee and moving to kneel beside his chair, "what if I told you that those future plans might need to be accelerated?" Understanding dawned slowly in his eyes, followed by wonder, joy, and a tenderness so profound it made her eyes fill with tears. "Sarah," he whispered, his hands framing her face. "Are you—" "Yes," she breathed. "We're going to have a baby, Samuel." A baby. His kiss was everything she had dreamed of during all those years when such happiness seemed impossible. Gentle and fierce, grateful and promising, full of the love that had survived every obstacle placed in its path. When they finally broke apart, Samuel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much it still amazes me that I'm allowed to say it. "You're not just allowed," Sarah replied, her hand covering his where it rested on her cheek. "You're required. For the rest of our lives, Samuel McKenna, you're required to love me and let me love you in return." Outside their kitchen window, the Montana mountains stood eternal and unchanged. But within the walls of their cabin, everything had been transformed by the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love over fear. Their child would be born into a world where love was celebrated rather than hidden, where truth mattered more than appearances, where two hearts that had found each other against all odds could build a future limited only by their capacity for joy. And as the morning sun climbed higher over the peaks that had sheltered their love story from its forbidden beginning to its blessed continuation, Sarah McKenna knew that sometimes the heart truly did know best, and that love, real, honest, freely chosen love, was always worth fighting for.